In a world filled with analytics, artificial intelligence, and different ways that machines are doing the things that humans used to do, critical thinking and creative thinking has never been more important. Creative and critical thinking are some of the most important things that we as educators can do to help our students succeed in the future. And it's become even more important in this age of analytics and artificial intelligence. This video was supposed to be a live stream this evening, but unfortunately I had some technical difficulties, so I'm just going to record it here in my studio and post it as a regular video. The idea for this video came about because for many years I've had a way that I like to do creative and critical thinking that I think is very useful. It's a way that we can introduce creative and critical thinking into almost everything we do in a classroom. And as a coincidence, one of my former students brought to my attention a very fascinating book at the beginning of last week, and I picked it up and read it cover to cover in a very short period of time because it was so compelling. The book is called The Eye Test: A Case for Human Creativity in the Age of Analytics by Chris Jones. Really good book. I highly recommend it. And this just really makes a case for why it's so important for us to go past just analytical information and get into the creative and critical thinking that is so important and makes us so distinctly human. This has long been something that I've been very interested in. In fact, I would say that probably one of the most life-changing courses that I ever took when I went to school was one on informal logic. One of the books that I've kept with me all these years after college was Logical Self-Defense by R.H. Johnson and J.A. Blair. This was the textbook for my informal logic course that I took when I did computer science. We used to have to take a logical and an informal logic course as part of our training. Now it's interesting, this is not a book on martial arts, although I did once see this filed at a bookstore underneath the martial arts section. This is a book on mental martial arts and mental logical defense. And what really fascinated me about this book is that it had a lot of information on logical fallacies. And I found it absolutely fascinating. You can see that I've gone through this book many, many times over the years subsequent to taking the course. But one of the problems that with any book that we have is that books are a linear experience. When we pick up a book, it goes from A to Z, and things like creative and critical thinking are subjects that aren't really linear. They're random. There's structure to them, to be sure. There's a lot of structure to them, and there's ways that we can build structure, but we don't build it by reading something from front to end. We build it by interacting with the concepts of creative and critical thinking in a more randomized way, and then we develop the ability to be creative and critical thinkers by doing so. So then the question becomes, how do we teach students and ourselves to be better creative and critical thinkers? Well, that's what I wanted to talk about in this video, a methodology, or really a tool that I like to use to do just that. Decks of cards. Many years ago, this particular deck, I picked this up back in 1989, 1990. There was a book by Roger von Ochs, and it was called A Whack to the Side of the Head. And it was all about how we could increase and foster creativity in our workplace, in our lives. And the Creative Whack Pack was a set of cards that you could purchase along with the book or apart from the book. And this particular Creative Whack Pack was divided into different categories. So you can see that we have different colors here on the cards here. And we had a little set of instructions here and this that we could go through, and we could do things like look at exploring, being an artist, being a judge, being a warrior, and these colors corresponded to these different types of activities. Now, what we could do with the cards is we could take a card, this one is Ask What If, and then we would have some instructions on what does it mean to ask what if. Check your timing. What does it mean to check your timing? We could go in, fight for it. What does it mean to fight for it? Put a lion in your heart. What does that mean? And the neat thing about these cards is that I could randomize them, I could mix them up, and whenever I wanted to do something creative, if I was working on a project and I was stuck or I wanted to improve the creativity on that project, I could just randomly pull a card and ask myself the question, imagine how others would do it. with some instructions. Now there are some different games and such that we can play here with the cards, not like a card game, but ways that we can organize these cards in order to make them more effective. And I really enjoyed working with the Creative Whack Pack. This was a great set of cards. I still like to play around with these cards, and these are something that I also can use in my classroom. So let's say, for example, I have a group of students and I want them to work on a project. I can actually give each group a different card and have them use that card in order to be more creative about their output. Now, I also have creative thinking cards. This is by a company called, or a website called makeitbrain.org, and these are creative thinking cards as well. In these creative thinking cards, and I'll just go here, we have a generation, perspective shifts, limitations, mental models, provocation, and in groups. So here again, we have color-coded cards. We can go in here and there's little ways that we can work with these cards to be more creative. For example, we can have the Trictionary. So this one here is use random stimuli like reading out words from the dictionary to provide a response. Or try using the last letter of one word as the starting letter for another word. Free associate words and concepts to spark connections. So this becomes another creative way that I can introduce creative training into my classroom. Now there are many different types of card decks out there, and I think that using a card deck is a fantastic way to do all sorts of different creative and thinking games. There's many different types of card decks we can have. This is a very interesting card deck, also from the Make It Brain organization. This one here has bias cards in here so that we can talk about logical biases. And it also has logical fallacy cards. So just like the books that talk about argumentation and the books that talk about logical fallacies, these cards will allow me to go through, look at things like the false cause fallacy, appeal to emotion fallacy, the fallacy, slippery slope, and different biases like groupthink, the Barnum effect, negativity bias. These provide ways for us to think about biases and fallacies in a non-linear way. Now we can of course support those through things like books. So for example, if I have a book on critical thinking, you'll see that a lot of the things that I have within the cards will be further explained in here. Things like begging the question, inconsistency, equivocation, false dichotomy. So these will go into more detail on what the fallacies are about, maybe even with more examples. But in a classroom setting, I can also use these cards to spark conversation, thinking, and creativity around fallacies, biases, and there's some games you can play or some different prescriptive ways that I can go through these card decks. Another fascinating card deck. You may have seen other types of card decks. Here's a couple of deluxe card decks. So these are by a company called Pip Decks. This is a storytelling tactic card deck. This is a workshop tactics card deck. These are a little bit bigger cards, but they also have a little bit more detail to them. So let's say, for example, I'm building up a story. I can use these storyteller tactics. There's a story building system in there. There's instructions on the cards. And then I can do things like organize my story. I have recipe cards to build my stories. I have things like concept cards to build the concepts, things like exploration cards, function cards, and this makes a lot more sense when you're working with the cards. But let's say, for example, audience profile. Here with audience profile, I can get information of why an audience profile is important when I'm doing a story, and then I can get some prescriptive information on how to work with building an audience profile for the stories that I might want to build. Now, Workshop is another one that I have here, and they do make a few other card decks as well. I only have a few card decks. Some of them, I'll show you a very cool digital thing in a moment here, but I also have Workshop card decks as well. These are quite nice, these card decks. They're pretty durable cards, a little bit bigger than some of the other ones, and maybe a little more dense in terms of the way that you would use them, but still non-linear, different types of ways that I can remix these cards, different types of ways that I can use these cards in order to mix things up and to get more creativity. Now, I really do like the tactile feel of working with these cards, being able to shuffle them, being able to rearrange them physically in my space. But there is another tool that I can use that's absolutely fantastic for when I'm on the go. This tool also allows me to carry a lot more card decks with me. I can use it on my phone and I can use it on my iPad. This tool is called Deckable. Deckable is an app that I can have on my iPad. I can also put it onto my phone, and I can put different decks of cards on here. One deck of cards that I'm really looking forward to getting, I am actually going to do a separate video just on this card deck, is called the Transform deck. I'm just waiting for the physical deck to arrive, and then I'll do another video on this. But the Transform deck is all about transforming learning content into interactive activities. What a great thing for people that like to do things with learning and technology. So if I go into this deck and pick, for example, 3 cards, it will actually shuffle through the deck, and this particular deck is about 52 cards. It'll give me 3 cards, and I'll have those 3 cards to start playing with. Now I can go ahead and move these cards around, so I do get the ability to do that. I could put them into a grid just to organize them. That's maybe better with a few more cards, but here we go. So here's an example of an activity to make learning even more fun. Votes contest. Learners will try a task where success is subjective. Then everybody will vote on each other's try. So this can be difficult, but votes can formalize it, put a new dimension in there, and then it gives you an example and some tips for running this activity. So I'm really excited. I've been playing around with the digital version of this card deck on Deckable for some time, and I'm now going to be receiving the physical cards, so I'll be able to actually mix and match them physically as well. But this is a perfect solution if I don't have the card deck with me, or if I want to play around on my iPad. The cards, of course, I can hand out in class, but this gives me an opportunity to have them with me on my phone or on my iPad. Later on, you'll be able to journal about the cards. You'll be able to share things out as well, your thoughts on the cards. And the neat thing about Deckable is that they have a whole bunch of different decks out there. So you can see here, for example, there's different types of decks that they will have here depending on your interests. Let's say I want to do brainstorming and ideation. You can see that there's different cards. For example, here's a card deck, Marshall McLuhan's card deck. It will cost $13.99 for this deck, and you'll get a sample of what the cards would have in it. So this one is actually based upon a deck of playing cards, but they've been modified, of course, to have Marshall McLuhan stuff in there. And that's a reasonable price, $13.99. You can see things like, here's the Shift Program deck, gives you, brainstorming and ideation, gives you an example of it. Again, you can go in there. This particular deck may not be available yet. So if I go by now, it's not available at this time. So there are some decks that are still up and coming, but some decks you can see has a price there. That one's $16.99. But you have all different categories, learning and coaching. There's some business decks as well. So if I go in here, there's some different business decks that I can have. This is actually a book. Hooked is also a book by Nir Eyal. Nir Eyal. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But this book has an associated deck. This deck has an associated book, and you can get that for $17.99 and then start playing around with this deck as well. In fact, this one here, you can even go out and you can purchase the physical deck if you want to from the Near and Far website. So there's all sorts of cool things that we can do here with Deckable. The deck that I'm most excited to start experimenting with is this Transform deck. This one's going to be very interesting. I'm going to do a completely separate video just on the Transform deck. So we know that creative and critical thinking is very important, and now we have a methodology where we can bring in things like decks of cards in order to foster that creative and critical thinking within our classroom. I hope you found this interesting. I was hoping that during the live stream we would get some conversation about different ways that you, the audience, work with helping develop creative and critical thinking skills. But because of the technical difficulties, that live stream kind of went off the rails. But comment down below. I really think this is an area where having some dialogue and some conversation can really help us all find better ways to help our students and those that we're training and those that we interact and ourselves become better creative and critical thinkers.